When it comes to the evolution of Christian belief, you might begin with rock star theologians like Augustine and Origen and Thomas, but today we're going to ignore them. I'd like to talk about an influential group that held what I would call a more natural understanding of Christianity, the artists of the Renaissance. I see the pinnacle of spiritual wisdom in 16th and 17th century Europe, a time when secular arts and sciences were rising, when the most insightful theologians were painters and sculptors, not academicians, when the most profound religious inspiration came from lay people, not clergy. What did they see that the church scholars overlooked? Putting it simply, they attached spiritual importance to human virtue and beauty, an idea that would grow into the doctrine we call Christian humanism. There's a lot happening under that skimpy label, so let's unpack it together, shall we? Renaissance art exhibits confidence that God and humankind are fundamentally united, that we are the same stuff. Notice, for example, that Michelangelo makes Adam every bit as handsome as the old man. Equal beauty implies a deeper spiritual equivalence, which made obvious sense to artists who idealized the human form. The two most persistent subjects are the crucifixion, God experiencing a human death, and the birth of Christ, always featuring a delightful, chubby baby. Let's begin with death. In the humanist imagination, the sacrifice of Christ is a universal gesture. It redeems every one of us, regardless of what we might believe. God is dying slowly and painfully for us because our reconciliation is an urgent mission for both parties. The crucifixion insists that restoring spiritual harmony between heaven and earth is important to God because He needs us. We are the carriers of His divine essence. His reason, goodness, and beauty dwell within us, and He will preserve those precious virtues at any cost to Himself, including death by torture. Velázquez's Cristo Crucificado is, to my eye, the single finest expression of that stunningly beautiful idea. Renaissance art celebrates Christ's dual nature, His transcendent divinity and His frail humanity, with realism and relish, enriched with lurid sacred hearts, crowns of thorns glistening and sticky with blood, and bruised, delicate waif bodies. Mediterranean painters and sculptors emphasize the crucifixion because it illustrates how far God is willing to go for us, His beloved. Christ's public humiliation and gruesome sacrifice are the irrefutable proof and final enactment of God's infinite love of mankind. A sublime moment in which He dies for us, conscious of the fact that we rejected Him. We broke His heart in the Garden of Eden, yet there's nothing He won't endure to redeem us. A person willing to die for their God is nothing new, but a God willing to suffer a criminal's public death and serve as a scapegoat for the creatures He adores is unlike anything else that's been contemplated. It is pure genius. This act of ultimate self-giving tells us not only that the Christian God is more loving than earlier gods, it says that we humans are greater than we're imagined to be in any other religious tradition because we are worthy of divine self-sacrifice. Without those elements of flesh and mortality, there's no paradox and mystery. There's no astounding beauty. There is only a supernatural God directing everything. Christianity ceases to be a profound religion and becomes merely a populist system for explaining nature, doing feebly what science does well. The belief in God as a person enduring an agonizing death motivated by his absolute devotion to us. Humanism, in a word, is what earns Christianity its place among the world's great religions. Now let's marry that Judaic tradition of sacrifice and the scapegoat with the Hellenistic traditions of humanism and heroism. The Greeks and Romans were, of course, very influential in the early days. They assumed, for example, that we look like the gods. But, of course, they would never have imagined a god bound and flogged and spat upon and finally murdered by humans. It was the Christians who went there. I'm going to skip centuries of Christian history and doctrinal evolution. Let's just say that by the Renaissance, Christian faith and practice would have been barely recognizable to the authors of the New Testament. To locate the summit of Catholic humanism, let's consider Michelangelo's David, a Renaissance monument in which sophisticated people like to detect classical stodginess. The sculpture is anything but stodgy. Yes, it quotes the Apollo Belvedere, but it's not an imitation or even an homage. This is a synthesis of Greek heroism and Christian optimism that signals the arrival of an advanced Catholic civilization willing to embrace its humanist convictions without apology. We view the statue from a low angle. David stands well above us. This magnificent figure insists that our true nature is heroic. Indeed, that a human being is the only possible hero, a belief that the Greeks had long celebrated in their art and literature. The idea that we alone can be heroic was old news in the classical world, a fact clear to anyone who has wondered why Homer's gods are so tiresome and disappointing in contrast to his human heroes. Anything that an old Greek god does can be undone. There are no permanent consequences, which means that there are no risks, and therefore no heroism. Only a mortal is able to wager everything and lose it forever. Hence Michelangelo's athletic, fiercely determined hero, pictured during the instant between committing to action and taking action. He's ready to kill Goliath without divine backup. Yes, he looks scared. Any real human being would be. But he's fully committed, and we can feel it. He doesn't become a hero through some miracle on the battlefield. He has always been one. The miracle happened long ago when nature created our kind. All this David needs is confidence in himself as heaven's beloved. Naked and mortal, armed with only a sling, he relies entirely on his humanity, which he trusts absolutely as a divine gift of formidable power. His faith in God and his faith in himself are one. How could the Almighty not fall in love with such a magnificent, audacious creature? It's no wonder he would die for us. The Michelangelo David insists that humanity's divine virtues compelled the sacrifice of Christ. God simply couldn't help redeeming us, so marvelous are we. And so, in carving this sculpture, Michelangelo enacted the very gesture that it illustrates: sheer daring. He pressed Catholic humanism to the edge of heresy, inviting us to wonder if the Judeo-Christian God might not envy mankind, as Homer's jaded, petulant gods clearly did. It's hardly a wonder that the David, and scores of other Renaissance masterworks, waves to us in contemporary art. Notice the familiar low-angle view here, the ideal body proportion, the athletic beauty, the courage, the pure humanity of this magnificent and eminently mortal young man. This picture by Sebastião Salgado is David, whether intentionally or not. I love the reversal of size. David is the giant here, and Goliath is a pipsqueak whose overwhelming power issues from the rifle. Here is a splendid example of the Renaissance Pietà in St. Peter's Basilica, made by Michelangelo. And here is another, in this gorgeous picture of a girl named Tomoko Uemura, who was gravely injured by mercury poisoning. We see the same intimacy, the love, the mysterious joy of the mothers. Did the photographer, William Eugene Smith, make a contemporary Pietà deliberately? Or was this familiar old genre unconsciously refracted in his image? It hardly matters. we still see the world in the way the Renaissance masters taught us to see it. In Renaissance art, we see a full understanding that beauty, like reason, is a heavenly gift. Raphael's Madonna with the blue diadem shows us an infant Jesus so irresistible that one longs to take him in their arms. This kind of beauty of the flesh is, to us, spiritually nourishing, even sanctifying. I would dare to describe it with the word Eucharistic. The heat and light of Catholic high culture have always been concentrated in the Mediterranean, a region of brilliant sunlight and bread and wine, where art and theology and science once commingled freely, spawning all manner of frisky intellectual tadpoles. But all good things must come to an end. The Reformation spread from the west and the north, regions of darkness and porridge and beer, where middle-brow theologians urged an unsophisticated populace to venerate the Bible and commune directly with God. There we find an emphasis on individualism and religious idiosyncrasy, a rejection of Nicene orthodoxy and central administration, and hostility toward urban sophistication. The Reformation was about many things, but a ferocious resentment of Mediterranean art and scholarship, seen as decadence and vanity, ranks high. The Church, many believed, was offending God and obscuring our true predicament under layers of ceremony, intellectual gibberish, and frivolous optimism. To Europeans beyond the borders of the old empire, the Church's emphasis on natural virtue and splendid works seemed impious. Mankind is not great, the reformers insisted. We've literally been cursed by the Almighty, who said, "In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread until you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken. You are dust, and to dust you shall return." We are weak, unclean sinners who long ago rejected God and have paid the price every day since. There's no cause for self-congratulation and none for optimism. We're made of dirt, not divine essence. Getting right with God will take more than priestly absolution and a few decades of the rosary. It's a lifelong struggle of pain and self-denial that's almost certain to fail in any case. The farther a society stood from Rome and Constantinople geographically, the more it would deviate from Christian humanism, and the less its early culture will impress us today. I speak of a Dark Age continent drenched in superstition and fear, plagued by opportunistic magicians and marauders and capricious local gods, confounded by pseudoscience and therapeutic leeching. Her various peoples trapped in the preliterate world of picture books and cartoons from which our Renaissance forebears struggled to liberate them. There was dear Erasmus, of course, but he would be conquered by Luther and the unthinking mobs he inspired. Those crowds sacked their own local churches as ruthlessly as Viking invaders might have done centuries earlier. Rome reacted poorly. The Counter-Reformation was driven by defensive hostility that resulted, for several decades between the 1530s and the 1590s, in a new authoritarianism that would save the Church but silence some of the most original and productive Catholic thinkers. The burning of Giordano Bruno and the trial of Galileo effectively awarded the European chair in science to Protestants, and from that point, responsibility for the basic elements of Western achievement would gradually change hands, while the voices of Catholic humanists went quiet. But let's remember that for 7/8 of Europe's Christian history, Western literature, music, painting, sculpture, architecture, philosophy, mathematics, and science evolved steadily toward the universal and the rational, and away from the local and the superstitious, the nearer one stood beside the humanizing energy of the Mediterranean. No wonder the Irish poet William Butler Yeats spoke about his 1928 poem Sailing to Byzantium with these words: "When Irishmen were illuminating the Book of Kells and making the jeweled croziers in the National Museum, Byzantium was the center of European civilization and the source of its spiritual philosophy. So I symbolize the search for a spiritual life by a journey to that city. Toward Byzantium, toward wisdom synthesized from the great ancient civilizations, Greco-Roman, Judaic, Christian, Egyptian, Islamic, toward the hub joining each to the other, toward the Mediterranean, toward that land of sunlight and bread and wine, and importantly, away from gloomy, superstitious purgatories like Britain and Ireland." Let's forget the West for a moment, along with its many grievances and automatic disapproval of all things unprofitable, its neurotic fear of nudity and laughter and joy. Let's look eastward and southward and reflect quietly. For the geniuses of the Renaissance whisper to us even today. They invite us to see how beautiful and good we can be, and how adored by heaven, so that we might recognize how beautiful and good everyone else can be, and how adored by heaven. And maybe, just maybe, stop damaging each other over superficial differences and ignoble desires. They know that we can do better than this. They know that we are, after all, of God.